For 2025, this is the best large family SUV in America, and it won't break the bank starting at $41,995. But more than just being affordable, the Traverse is huge on the inside. This received our best score ever in this segment in our 24-inch roller bag test, besting the nearest competitor by a whopping 100%. Yep, twice the number of roller bags behind the third row as any of its close competition. And it also receives top marks in our child seat test. But the Traverse is not perfect. I promise I'll circle around to that lack of perfection by the end of the video, but let's talk about what the Traverse has going for it first. Price and size are two big reasons to get this over the competition. We'll talk about size in just a moment, but I should tell you the price first, because this is only about $1,000 more expensive than a regular Toyota Highlander, about $3,500 less than a Grand Highlander, which I think is the closest competitor to the Traverse, as long as we're not talking about the other GM triplets. And we do need to mention those. There's the GMC Acadia and the Buick Enclave. They're all closely related to this, and there's a significant amount of pricing overlap between the three. So if you're trying to decide between Acadia, Traverse, and Enclave, really it's going to come down to style and exactly which features are you interested in that may only be available in one of them, because there are a few things here and there. And the infotainment screens on the inside, those do change around a bit. This has a big horizontal screen, the Acadia has a big vertical screen, and the Enclave has one big screen across the dashboard. Then there is the style. The Traverse has the most aggressive, I guess you'd say the sportiest look. I'm not quite clear whether that applies to something this big, but it certainly looks an awful lot like the Tahoe. And size-wise, this is closer to a Tahoe than a Highlander, including the width. This is 79.6 inches wide, making it about an inch wider than the Grand Highlander. And almost all of that size increase goes right here into the cabin. You will notice that not only is the cabin taller and longer than average for a three-row SUV, it's also wider than average. Not quite as wide as the Tahoe, but actually pretty close. With an overall length of 204.7 inches, the Traverse is certainly on the long side of this segment, but I think it wears its size pretty well. We have a boxy and upright front end and a pretty square box behind, although they've tried to disguise it a little bit with that curvaceous third row window. The big thing, of course, is that we have a really long wheelbase and pretty short overhangs. So Chevy is making the most use of the space that they have. And we have a significantly shorter hood than in a Grand Cherokee L, which was designed for V8 engines and inline-six engines to live up front. So there's a lot of space efficiency going on with the Traverse, actually quite similar to that Grand Highlander. But in the Grand Highlander, they've prioritized rear passenger room a little bit more than cargo room, and I think Chevy found a slightly better balance. Although it's worth noting that in addition to a better balance, Chevy also has more room on the inside than we find in the Grand Highlander. Just the measure from the firewall, basically the footwell for the driver and front passenger, all the way back here to the cargo hatch, it's about 2.5 inches longer than in a Grand Highlander, and that's where a lot of the extra cargo room comes from. We also have some pretty wide tires. Keep in mind we're driving the RS trim right now, which means we have 275 45 R22s, but even the base tire size is pretty meaty. 255 65 R18s are what you're going to find on the base model. That's logical because this is no lightweight SUV. 4,865 pounds is what this model tips the scales at, which means it is a little bit lighter than some of those Grand Cherokee models, but it's not an enormous amount lighter. The rear end of the previous Traverse always looked a bit unfinished to me. It was a little bit too round, a little bit too anonymous. This has a bit more style, but they didn't go crazy. We have these sort of split fishtail taillights in the rear, full LEDs of course, and quad square exhaust tips down there at the bottom. I guess you'd say one exhaust opening for each cylinder. Then behind this cover, we have a 2-inch receiver, and for 2025, every Traverse is rated to tow 5,000 pounds. We also get, interestingly, not just backup cameras on the rear, but we get a 360-degree camera system standard. The inclusion of the surround view camera is pretty impressive because it doesn't take the place of other safety systems that we find in the competition. In most of the entries in this segment, you'll get adaptive cruise control or blind spot monitoring standard, but not both. And Chevy decided to give us pretty much everything in the kitchen sink absolutely standard. Really, the only things that are optional are GM's auto park system, where it will automatically parallel park for you, the Super Cruise hands-free driving assistance system, and driver attention alert. Under the hood, we find one of the controversial changes versus the last generation Traverse. Instead of a naturally aspirated V6, we find a turbocharged 4-cylinder engine, just like we find under the hood of the Grand Highlander. Only this engine produces more power and more torque, 328 horsepower, 326 pound-feet of torque. Interestingly, though, it's not really any faster than the outgoing V6, even though it definitely is more powerful. On the other hand, it is significantly more fuel efficient than the old V6. We get 23 miles per gallon front-wheel drive, 21 miles per gallon all-wheel drive according to the EPA. That's about a 5% improvement over the V6 in terms of the EPA score, but in our real-world testing, it's actually about 20% better than the old V6 in real-world driving. It's just not going to sound as good. I'm 6 feet tall, about 180 pounds. I found these seats to be pretty comfortable. The seat bottom cushion is not too short, not too long, but it is on the firmly padded side of things. We have a powered memory-linked tilt telescopic steering column, which is somewhat unusual. Not all the competition has a memory-linked column. If you frequently have taller and shorter drivers driving the same vehicle, this might be a great thing to choose. We also have 4-way adjustable lumbar support for the driver and front passenger seats, but the front passenger seat does not actually have the same range of motion as the driver's seat. The seat bottom cushion does not independently adjust for tilt. And that means if you want that passenger seat to be a little bit higher up, it also kind of feels like you're in an ejection seat going out the window. On the other hand, front row headroom is the best in this segment, so if you frequently have taller people in the vehicle, this might be a good choice. And even back here in the second row, where headroom is not quite tops, it's still very solid, even with this big panoramic moonroof above my head. That definitely cuts down on headroom a little bit. When it comes to legroom, we have 117.9 inches of combined legroom in here. Now, with legroom figures, it's important to remember that not every manufacturer measures their legroom according to the same standard. So in our in-house measurements, we do have a little bit more room from the firewall to the back of those rear seat backs in the third row than we have in the Grand Highlander, but we also have slightly thicker seats in this model, a little bit of extra padding on the seat back cushion, and that is probably where the difference comes in. Bottom line, they're basically equal. And as far as legroom goes, it's really going to depend on exactly whether you fit in each of the various rows, because we get significantly more headroom back there in the third row. Now, to get back there into the third row, you have some choices. You can fold that down with the lever, or you can press the electric release button, which is going to tilt and slide the seats forward to allow you easier access into the back. And if I can squeeze in between the plants on this side of the car, I will show you how that looks from this side. There's also another release on the seat bottom cushion for that tilt and slide action forward. If I tilt and slide that way and then hop into the rear, it does not move all the way back to the rearest portion of its travel, interestingly enough. And that gives you more legroom in the third row, still a solid amount in the second row. If, however, I pull that bar, scoot the seat all the way back, you will notice you couldn't actually sit behind that second row seat, at least not at my height. Maybe if I really tucked my legs in there, I might be able to squeeze in there for a moment. Obviously, if I was a smaller person, that would work too. But I could definitely sit in the middle seat if I really, really needed to. Now that may sound crazy, but if I grab the camera here and then go up to this second row position, you can see that I still have quite a lot of legroom, even though this seat is not all the way back. In our child seat tests, the Traverse scored incredibly well. We have easy to find latch anchors, no covers or Velcro sections or anything like that, and that makes snapping in child seats using the latch anchor system very, very easy. With the fixed anchors or with those webbed anchors, your choice. Latching in a child seat like this is pretty easy. I'm not going to deploy the anti-rebound leg on this seat just to make it a little bit easier to show you the installation here and show you that we have plenty of room even with the front seats comfortably adjusted for taller adults. I'm 6 feet tall, and as you can see, you could definitely be taller than me and still have an adequate amount of clearance between the child seat and the driver. We have maybe about 3.5, 4 inches or so of clearance there. Keep in mind, you do want to look at the clearance figures required for your child seat and in the vehicle's instruction manual as well to see how much clearance you need between the one and the other. There's another trick that this vehicle has up its sleeve. If you remove a rear-facing child seat like that, as long as it doesn't have that anti-rebound leg, you can tilt and slide this seat forward in this manner. This works especially well with these undockable child seats, or of course with forward-facing child seats, which are permanently installed using the latch anchors. You obviously can't do this with the shoulder belt because the shoulder belt's not going to move with the seat if it's ratcheted and locked in place. But it does make getting in and out of the third row significantly easier than most of the competition. For some reason, this is a feature that we don't find on all of the family vehicles out there, including something like the Toyota Grand Highlander, which is certainly on the large side of things. Now, if I whip out my trusty tape measure here and measure this out, you can see that even in this constricted area here, we have about 15.5 or 16 inches of clearance between the door opening and the seat itself. That's about double what we find in a Honda Pilot with some of the exact same child seats latch anchored into place. And that's because in a Pilot or a Grand Highlander, or indeed most of the competition, all you can do is slide the seat forward. You can't tilt up the seat back in this way. Now let's get to the cargo area I mentioned earlier. Behind this power hatch, we find about 23 cubic feet of cargo space, and we also find a pretty prominent latch on the hatch. If you're about 6'1", 6'2", you're probably gonna be bopping your head on there. At 6 feet tall, my hair is definitely grazing it, as you can see right there. But this cargo area is one of the longest in this segment, and that's really, really important. The distance between the hatch and the seat back is critically about 3 inches longer than just about everybody else. The only problem for me back here is the somewhat finicky power third row seats. At least they move pretty quickly. This is a full speed clip, but sometimes it doesn't respond to exactly what you're after. And importantly, if the second row seat is all the way back in its tracks, it won't actually power fold the third row seats without some extra help, even though it will fit. When it comes to our 24-inch roller bag test, this may be the best score ever for a 3-row crossover. If I hit that power button, I suspect it may only need just a tiny bit of assistance, but check it out. You can actually squeeze 4 of those 24-inch roller bags back there. Turns out no extra assistance needed. And even more impressively is that under these 24-inch roller bags, there's actually a 22-inch roller bag under the floor, and there's also a spare tire under there. So this has by far the most practical behind the third row storage room in this entire segment. Want even more room? Go ahead and fold those seats down. Let's see how many bags we can toss in here. We may actually run out of 24-inch roller bags. We actually ran out of roller bags, had to go grab some more. Let's see how this goes. I think this might work. That is 11 24-inch roller bags behind that hatch. Just to put that in perspective, this is how much luggage you can get in a Traverse and still carry either 4 or 5 people, depending on whether or not you get those captain's chairs. As we look around the interior, keep in mind this is the RS trim, which was the top-end model for 2024. For 2025, we now have a High Country trim, which is styled very similarly to other Chevy High Country trucks. Here we have a sunglass holder there, controls for the big panoramic moonroof, slide to the side sun visors. Speaking of that panoramic moonroof, it goes to just about the second row passengers' heads. I have that second row seat folded so you can see that somewhat triangular window back there for the third row. I didn't have any visibility problems, but I think shorter kids probably won't be able to see out much. That could increase car sickness. Over here we have height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, height adjustable headrests as well. This has the RS logo embossed there in the headrest. Some subtle red accents on mostly a charcoal and monochromatic interior. This interior definitely is very, very dark. If you don't like that, you definitely want to take a look at the High Country model because I think the colors there are certainly a bit more pleasing. There's that seat bottom cushion I mentioned earlier, pretty flat, not terribly aggressive bolsters on the side there either. Moving over to the front doors, we have some hard plastics and some soft plastics. Hard plastics around the lower portion of the door, bottle holder, etc. Soft plastics for the mid and upper section, and then lots of red accent plastic trim here. You can see it kind of fades from more of a solid red to more of a mostly black with red dots here in the dashboard. It's kind of a subtle transition. I do think that's attractive, but I would love to see the High Country model in person. I have not, unfortunately, been able to experience that for myself. One big advantage to the Traverse is simply the standard screen setup. We have some absolutely enormous screens in the dashboard with one of the largest implementations of Apple CarPlay. Yep, we still get CarPlay here. If you were concerned about that, keep in mind that General Motors is only ditching CarPlay in their electric models. Here, we have the full Google suite. We have all the same software we find in those other vehicles with complete voice commands for the Google system. We have the auto parking assistant there for automatically parking, parallel parking, perpendicular parking, etc. That is an option. That is not standard. Sorry about the screen turning blank. I keep pressing the power button here on top. I have to say that after having lived with the system for a while in a Chevy Blazer EV for about 5 months or so, I am no closer to getting used to that power touch button location, because I do seem to want to rest my finger there whenever I want to adjust the volume. Headlight controls, those are in here as well, just in case you're wondering. Moving over to the instrument cluster, it is a configurable instrument cluster, but not as configurable as some of GM's vehicles in the past. You can move different modules over here to this side. You can also choose whether you want a full map display inside. That's probably my favorite look there, to go with the full map display over here. And if you want Google Maps on one side and Apple Maps on the other, you can do that, because this now is an Apple Maps display. So it does have full screen control over both screens for the Apple CarPlay interface. Now this model also has Super Cruise, definitely a reason to get the Traverse, and you can add Super Cruise to any of the different trims. It's kind of an expensive option on the base model. It's over a $3,000 option, but it works on a lot of roads, including many rural roads. We'll talk about that in just a second. The Super Cruise readout is right here as an LED that changes colors. Driver monitoring system right there on top of the steering column. On the steering wheel, we have an L button. That's important to understand, because instead of manual shift with these paddles, you now have to put the transmission in L, then it functions as a gear limiter, not a true sort of actual command for what gear you want to be in. On this side, we have buttons for the infotainment system and that screen, heated steering wheel, etc. But the track up-down and the volume up-down buttons, those are on the back of the steering wheel like we find in other GM vehicles. We have a column-mounted shifter to give us more room in the center console. And we definitely have a very roomy console here. Big air vents, some physical controls for the dual zone climate control, or I should say front 2 zones, because we have a 3-zone system here. Big cup holders right here. I had no problem with large takeout drinks. Then there's another storage cubby behind. There's lots of shiny black plastic here, and even though this has only about 3,000 miles on the odometer, it is already nicely scratched. Padded center armrest right there. 2 more cup holders behind that for the second row. And here is a lot of storage. It's a pretty deep storage well. You can actually fit a gallon of milk in there. I tried. And then we have that removable shelf. If that's not enough storage for you, there's another storage area under that center console where you can put things like bags. Here's a close-up look of the trim panel to the left of the driver. You can see how it starts off mostly red, and then it goes there towards mostly black. I think that's a really elegant design, although I would love to see a few different trims offered in the Traverse. Over here we have a button module where we find the electric parking brake, the drive mode selector, all-wheel drive, auto, start-stop, enable, disable, and a physical dimmer control. But you notice again, no physical headlight switches. Those are in the infotainment system. All right, let's get the Traverse out on the road. The first thing you're going to notice, of course, is that 4-cylinder engine sound. It's certainly gruff on the outside and gruff on the inside. And unfortunately, that gruffness is not accompanied by greater performance. 0 to 60 in this model happened in 7.1 seconds versus 6.9 seconds in the last Traverse V6 that we tested. On the other hand, passing performance appears to be better, and the transmission's pretty responsive. So climbing this hill, it's absolutely not a problem. And because we have so much low-end torque, the transmission does not need to downshift as frequently to accelerate uphill like this, or when you're pulling a lightweight trailer, say around 3,000 or 4,000 pounds. This actually feels less stressed than the V6 does, oddly enough. And a lot of that just has to do with that amount of low-end torque that we get. The downside is that you hear so much more of this engine than the V6 engine, and as a car buying public, we've been programmed to think that V6 engines sound better than 4-cylinder engines. I have to admit, I believe that myself. And this would not be a problem to me at all if I just couldn't hear the engine, which is kind of weird because you don't really hear too much else in the cabin. Measured 71.5 decibels in steady state travel at 50 miles an hour, making this one of the quieter entries in this segment. But engine noise, it's actually one of the loudest in this segment. You really hear a lot of that 4-cylinder sound. Now let's get to the rest of the numbers, because everything else about the Traverse is excellent. 60 to 0 happened in 116 feet. That's a pretty short stopping distance, not just given the curb weight of the vehicle, but compared against some of the lighter competition, thanks to the wide tires that we have on this model. And handling, that's excellent as well. This has a really great feel to it out on the road. It doesn't drive nearly as big as you might think, given the size of this. As we turn the corner onto this tighter winding road, everything comes together surprisingly well. Even given the size of the Traverse, it drives significantly smaller than you might think, especially if you're driving the all-wheel drive model, which we are driving. But there is something you should know. Unless you engage all-wheel drive, you don't have all-wheel drive, and that is somewhat unique in this segment. Most of the competition, even the slip and grip style systems where you have to wait for some slip to happen before it sends power around, they'll send power to the rear after a slip occurs, hence the name slip and grip. This does not. If the all-wheel drive button is not engaged, you're front-wheel drive only. That maximizes fuel economy, but it does mean that if you forget, you're just gonna sit there and spin and spin and spin. It will never ever send power to the rear axle unless you engage that mode with the all-wheel drive button. When it comes to the final handling score, I'm going to give this an A-. It doesn't cut the rug quite as tightly as some of the rear-wheel drive options. However, it is definitely solid given the size of this, and it feels significantly more nimble than any of the full-size body-on-frame SUVs. So if you're trying to compare this against a Chevy Tahoe or a Toyota Sequoia or a Wagoneer or something along those lines, this is definitely going to feel tighter and sharper out on the road. I'm going to give ride quality a B in this RS trim. Out on this gravel road, you'll definitely feel some of the smaller imperfections coming into the cabin because we have those relatively low profile tires. I was able to sample very briefly a base front wheel drive model from a dealer, and the ride quality definitely is a bit better on those chunkier tires. That's something that we see in pretty much all of the competition, and it is something that you need to keep in mind. If you're looking at those low profile options, ride quality is going to suffer a bit, but the suspension is well tuned. We don't see any sort of upset in the rear suspension over broken pavement or on road surfaces that are less than perfect like this. I also don't think that the ride quality, even in the RS trim, is a problem at all for longer road trips. This is pretty comfortable, even on highway expansion joints. You're just going to feel them a bit more in the cabin than in the base model. We've been averaging 21.9 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving, and out on the open highway, we were getting 27 miles per gallon at 70 miles an hour. This is a surprisingly efficient engine and transmission combo. The question I have for you all is that fuel efficiency enough of a countermeasure for the gruff nature of the engine? Because so far we've had a lot of family rolling through this vehicle, we've had a lot of visitors and guests as we approach Christmas here, and a lot of folks have been hopping in the vehicle thinking, oh wow, that's nice, that's a really cool big screen, the seats are comfy, I like the big glass roof, etc. Then you start it up and they're like, huh, that wasn't what I expected. And you get it out on the road and they're like, that engine, it just doesn't sound as nice as I had expected. I don't think that's a problem for the base Traverse. I think it's more of a problem for the High Country and this RS trim, and it's also a problem for the Acadia and the Enclave, because the Enclave has the same engine, no extra sound deadening, and it's trying to go for a more premium customer, someone that maybe is cross-shopping an Acura MDX. So I'd love to know what you all think about that. I think it's something that you will certainly get used to, and it's not really a problem per se. It just doesn't sound as nice as I want it to sound. And am I right to be disappointed? I really would love you all to tell me down there. That brings us on to the pricing. Again, the LT trim started at $41,995, and that gets you a ton of standard equipment. We have the base 17.7-inch infotainment system, wireless charging, adaptive cruise control, the power hatch, 18-inch alloy wheels, the spare tire, and heated seats and a heated steering wheel. Those are all standard features on the Traverse. And that's why the base model is a really, really good deal. But some of the options can get pricey. It's $2,500 for the panoramic moonroof on the base model because you also have to upgrade the wheels. It's $3,935 for Super Cruise, $2,000 for all-wheel drive, and up to $995 for certain paint options. Now, if you get fully loaded and all carried away with the options, you can get up to about $62,000 or so, which brings us on to the competitive pricing chart. As you can see here, something like a Kia Telluride is going to be notably less expensive, although remember, it is smaller. Something like a Grand Cherokee or a Tahoe, those will be more expensive, but they're not necessarily larger or more accommodating in every dimension. And also, as I said before, there is a lot of pricing overlap between the three General Motors triplets. We'll get to that in just a bit, but we should dive into the Grand Highlander first, because I think this is the toughest and most compelling competitor in this segment. The big thing that we get in the Grand Highlander is not just one, but two different hybrid systems. I would go for the traditional Toyota hybrid system in the mid-level trims. That gives you notably less power than we find in the Traverse, 245 horsepower, and also less power than you find in the regular Grand Highlander, but you'll get well over 30 miles per gallon in average driving. It's EPA rated for around 35 mpg. That's definitely achievable if you treat it nicely. If you want more oomph and you want better fuel economy, there is the Hybrid Max system available, 362 horsepower, but that's not the smoothest hybrid system that Toyota has ever created. Now, I think that the Grand Highlander looks great. I think it actually looks a little bit better to my eye on the outside than the Chevy. It's going to be a bit more expensive in base trims. Actually, I think a slightly better deal in the upper end trims than the Chevy, but it's not quite as large inside. Remember that legroom figures are a bit fungible, and that third row moves forward and backwards, so you can apportion the space more equitably. But if you tried to fit the same number of bags behind the third row in the Grand Highlander, you'll notice you don't have as much room in the other rows because there's simply not as much room inside the Grand Highlander as in the Traverse. So when it comes to the luggage battle, the child seat battle, etc., the Traverse is an easy win there. On the reliability front and the fuel economy front, logically, those wins go to the Grand Highlander. This is a really tough call between these two. I think an easier call is the Chevy Tahoe versus the Traverse. The Tahoe is significantly more expensive. It's, of course, a traditional body-on-frame SUV. It does have more legroom and more cargo room on paper, but in reality, it feels about the same on the inside except for the width of the cabin. You'll notice that the Traverse, although it's wide, is not as wide as the Tahoe. Tahoe is a pretty roomy vehicle inside. It's also going to ride better, tow more, not get great fuel economy, let's be honest, even with the base 5.3-liter V8. And it's going to have a more rugged four-wheel drive system. So if you do plan on going further off the beaten path, you're going to want to get the Z71 Tahoe, not the Z71 Traverse. Of course, if you want to save a little bit of cash, you might be looking at something like a Palisade or a Telluride. We'll talk about the Telluride here, but this is really a placeholder for the Pilot, the Pathfinder, the regular Highlander, etc., all of the slightly smaller vehicles in this segment. The Telluride is one of the largest, smaller, mid-size entries, whatever you want to call it, and it's incredibly practical, but you will notice that it is smaller inside. We get a less comfortable third row, we get less cargo capacity behind that third row, even though, again, the Telluride is pretty big and boxy. This is just that next level of capacity. So if you're the kind of family that really needs to be able to carry 5 or 6 people in relative comfort and you want to take 5 people's worth of luggage with you for a weekend away, you're going to be better able to do that in the Traverse than in the Telluride unless you start packing lighter. Because even if you have to fold down one side of the third row, for instance, you still have significantly more room than you have in the Telluride. You could put 5, 6 24-inch roller bags very easily back there and squeeze 5 people in decent comfort without having someone in the middle seat in the Traverse. So it's just a lot roomier there. Also, keep in mind that the Telluride is probably going to get a refresh here soon because we have recently seen the redesigned Palisade, and that's coming to the United States probably sometime next year. It's going to get a much squarer look. Doesn't appear to be any bigger on the inside, but it's certainly more tech forward than we find in the current Telluride lineup, which has the previous generation Kia infotainment system. Next up, we should just briefly run through the Grand Cherokee L. Clearly, this is rear-wheel drive, it's more rugged, more off-road focused, but it's also smaller inside, and we don't get the V8 engines anymore. You can get a hands-off-the-wheel steering assistance system on the Grand Cherokee L, but it's kind of a pricey option. It's only available in the upper-end trims. Also, the V6 engine is just not very exciting in the Grand Cherokee L. It has a lot of Grand Cherokee to move, and there's not enough power in my opinion. We all know the inline-6 turbo engines are coming to the Grand Cherokee. We just don't know exactly when that will be. The price tag on the Grand Cherokee L, that's bonkers high. The interior, it's significantly more refined, significantly more premium than in the Traverse, but you're also going to pay for that extra premium feel. There are a lot of deals going on because Jeep has suddenly realized their pricing got out of control, so you're probably going to get $5,000 or $6,000 without too much haggling off your Grand Cherokee L, at least for the moment. If you want high towing capacity, go with the Grand Cherokee. If you want room, go for the Traverse. And that brings us along to the bottom line here and our last three-way comparison, which is Enclave versus Acadia versus Traverse. Bottom line, same ingredients, different recipe. The Acadia has a vertical screen, I think a more attractive interior, and more interior color options available. So the lighter interior colors definitely help break up the visual space inside. The Traverse is black on black on black, and it does feel kind of like a really dark black hole sometimes inside. The red finishes that we have in the RS trim, they're not the most premium touches, and if you get the Denali version of the Acadia, you can get much nicer trim inside. And it's worth noting there's a lot of price overlap at the upper end. So if you're looking for a mid or an upper level trim of Traverse, I would probably get the Acadia. On the Enclave front, you have to like the particular style going on, but the Enclave does feel more premium than the Traverse. not more premium than the Acadia. I think it's pretty equal with that model, but I love the styling in the Enclave. The downside is that the infotainment system is a little bit slimmer and longer, so it's not really as usable. For instance, your CarPlay projection, your Android Auto projection, it's going to be smaller in the Enclave, whereas you get that really, really big widescreen presentation in the Traverse and then a big vertical orientation in the Acadia. Big thing to know, if you want a head-up display, you can get that in the Acadia and you can get it in the Enclave. You can get a few more luxury features in both of those models than you can in the Traverse, and that's why their top-end prices are a little bit higher. The last caution here, as practical as these vehicles are, the three General Motors triplets, they all have the same problem, which is that 2.5-liter four-cylinder turbo. The engine itself is not a problem. The performance I don't think is a problem either, but the lack of sound deadening I think is a problem. And that becomes more of a problem the more options you stick on it, and as you work your way on up to the Enclave, which they want to position as an accurate MDX alternative. It's just not quiet enough, in my opinion, there. It's something I could get used to, and I would probably get used to that quite nicely in the Acadia because I think that'd be very easy to live with, but it is certainly something to keep in mind. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and what would you get in this segment, bearing in mind that this has the most practical cargo area in a mid-size or full-size 3-row crossover SUV, whatever you want to call this thing, biggest, most practical cargo area that we have ever tested here. See all of you later.